Hello. How would you like to be able to hear a chord and know immediately what that chord is without having to go searching for it, without having to consult a lead sheet, without having to ask somebody? You just hear it and you know immediately what it is in your head. You can do that. Hi, this is Terry Gunn, and today we're going to talk about intervals. At first, that's going to seem a little elementary, but if you learn to recognize intervals, you will learn to recognize chords. You can train your ear to do this yourself. Let me show you what I'm talking about. We use scales. We've talked about scales in past videos. Scales are used to build intervals. Intervals are used to build chords. And chords are what we use to play songs. We add the melody, and it all works together, and we make music every week. So bear with me for just a few minutes today. Even though you think this may be terribly elementary, I promise you it'll do you some good. If you've never done this before, then it may take you a little while to grasp it, but it's worth it. Let's start with C. When you played that one note, there really is no interval, because an interval, as you well know, is the distance between 2 points. And when there's only one note, there really aren't 2 points. It's called a unison, perfect unison. It would be written P1, okay? Now the truth is, if you're playing a piano, there are actually 3 strings being played when you play one note. And hopefully they're all tuned exactly the same, and you can't hear the individual strings because they are playing in unison. Okay? The first note of the scale is P1, perfect unison. The distance between the first note of the scale and the second note of the scale is called a major second. Okay? The first note and the second note of the scale. A major second. The distance between the first note of the scale and the third note of the scale is called a major third. All right? The distance between the first note of the scale and the fourth note of the scale is called a perfect fourth. It's not major, it's a perfect fourth. And the distance between the first note of the scale and the fifth note of the scale is called a perfect fifth. The distance between the first note of the scale and the sixth note of the scale is called a major sixth. And one more, the distance between the first note of the scale and the seventh note of the scale is called a major seventh. Each of these intervals can be expanded, or they can be made smaller and be called a diminished interval. For example, start on C, go up 2 half steps, we have a major second. If we want to make that smaller, we make it 1 half step. That is called a minor second. A major interval, when it is made a half step smaller, becomes a minor interval. More likely you recognize the third, the major third from C to E. If you make it smaller from C to E flat, it becomes a minor third. And you probably recognize that as being the difference between a major triad and a minor triad. The third is lowered a half step. So a major interval, when lowered a half step, becomes a minor interval. A perfect fourth, when it's made smaller by a half step, is not minor. But a perfect interval becomes diminished. Okay, that's a diminished fourth. A perfect interval, when it becomes larger, is an augmented interval. It becomes an augmented fourth. A perfect fifth, if you make it smaller by a half step, it becomes a diminished fifth. And you'll notice that that diminished fifth is exactly the same interval as the augmented fourth. A major interval, made smaller, becomes minor. Made smaller again, becomes diminished. A perfect interval, when made smaller, is diminished. And any of them, when they're made larger, become augmented intervals. That's just good stuff to know. We'll put it into practice here in just a minute. I mentioned that there are a lot of overlapping intervals. The major third, When you lower the half step, it becomes a minor third. And so the minor third is exactly the same thing as an augmented second. So here's the second, major second, augmented, and a major third, minor. They are the same interval. As I mentioned a while ago, the perfect fourth, when raised a half step, becomes an augmented fourth, and that's the same interval as a diminished fifth. Augment the fifth, it's the same interval as a minor sixth, because the major sixth is right here, and lower the half step becomes minor. All right? All of these intervals are either major or perfect. The second and the third, and the sixth and the seventh are major intervals. The unison, the fourth, the fifth, and the octave are perfect intervals. And it can go further than that. Ninths, 11ths, 13ths. It can go further. But for all practical purposes at this point, we're going to stay within the octave. So let me summarize. We build scales to make intervals. The intervals help us make chords. The chords we put into progressions and phrases and add a melody, and we make beautiful music every week. But your job the next few days, weeks, whatever it takes, just play around with these intervals. I know they're really elementary, and I'm repeating myself now, but spend some time learning the sounds that these different intervals make. You won't be sorry, because it'll do something magical for you. You'll begin to hear chords like you've never heard chords before, and that's a good thing. So take some time and mess with some intervals for a while. Do something noteworthy. We'll talk again next time.